I was unjustly evicted. Get out of here in 24 hours. The building manager didn't know I was a lawyer. I can still feel the dampness of the eviction notice in my trembling hands. As I stared at my ransacked apartment, drawers pulled open and documents scattered all over the floor, Frank Wilkins stood at the door with a smug smile he made no effort to hide. "Gas leak," he said, twirling the master keys between his fingers. "Emergency." I had to come in. Even in shock, I could tell there was no smell of gas. None at all. What was missing, though, was my laptop, and all my client files had been thoroughly rummaged through. "You have 24 hours to leave," he continued, pointing at the official notice now crumpled in my hand. "Get out of here. People like you don't belong in this building anymore." He had no idea who I really was. He didn't know I was a lawyer specialized in real estate law. He didn't realize he had just picked the worst possible person to try and intimidate. My name is Mia Reynolds. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how I lost my apartment and, unintentionally, started a battle that would change an entire city's real estate system. I'm awaiting your feedback on this first part before continuing. Everything started 5 months before that eviction scene. I was sitting in my cubicle on the 42nd floor of Baker Thompson & Wright law firm, staring at a pile of documents for a corporate merger that would benefit billionaire investors while displacing hundreds of families from an up-and-coming neighborhood. This wasn't why I had become a lawyer. I closed my eyes, and as had been happening more and more lately, I saw my mother's face when I was 15. The three of us, Mom, Dad, and me, were sitting at the kitchen table as a court officer handed them foreclosure papers. "You've got 30 days, he said, without even looking my parents in the eyes. Later, we found out the mortgage they had signed included predatory clauses in fine print that no one had explained to them. That was the day I decided I would become a lawyer. And there I was, a decade later, working for the same kind of people who took homes away from working families. "Reynolds, I need those Oak Street documents reviewed by the end of the day," said Gregory Miller, a junior partner, tossing yet another folder onto my already overloaded desk. "The client wants to speed up the process of removing the current tenants." Something snapped inside me. "No," I said simply. "What?" Gregory paused, clearly not used to hearing that word. "I said no, Greg. I'm not doing it." I stood up, surprised at how calm I sounded. "In fact, I'm resigning." 2 weeks later, I was standing in front of the freshly installed sign on the door of a small office just 3 blocks from Sunset Towers, where I had lived for 3 years. Reynolds Legal Aid, specialist in real estate law and tenant defense. The space was tiny, a cramped reception area, my office, and a closet we optimistically called the file room. The rent was steep for such a small place, but the location was perfect, close to the courthouse and accessible for clients from vulnerable neighborhoods. My entire savings were invested in that office, and every penny mattered. I cut every possible expense, including keeping my modest apartment at Sunset Towers instead of looking for something closer to what my former coworkers would consider acceptable. "You're making a mistake, Mia," Sophia Chen, my friend and former colleague, told me during a quick coffee break between her meetings. "You were next in line to become a junior partner. All that stability, thrown away to defend people who can barely pay you? That's exactly why I'm doing it, Sophia. Who else is going to fight for them?" She shook her head, glancing at her designer watch. "Well, when you realize idealism doesn't pay the bills, your desk will still be there." I smiled, appreciating her concern, but knowing I was never going back. In the first few weeks, the line of clients was small but steady. Families facing unfair foreclosures, tenants dealing with negligent landlords, seniors threatened with eviction from homes they had lived in for decades. It was during that time that I started to notice changes at Sunset Towers. The red brick building had an old-school charm, with its 12 floors and partial view of the city park. Built in the 1960s, it housed an eclectic mix of residents, teachers, nurses, artists, small business owners, and elderly tenants who had been there since the building first opened. Frank Wilkins had taken over as building manager and superintendent 6 months earlier. Since then, I had noticed a steady stream of dumpsters filled with construction debris as apartments on the upper floors were renovated and advertised for rents far above what most current residents could afford. They broke a wall in the apartment above mine last night. At 11 p.m., complained Eleanor Diaz, my 67-year-old neighbor, as we shared the elevator. The retired English teacher had been living in the building for over 20 years. Did you complain to Frank? I asked. Of course I did. You know what he said? Ma'am, you should consider moving to a quieter place, like a retirement community. She shook her head, outraged. As if I could afford that on my pension. That wasn't the first complaint I had heard about Frank. Longtime tenants said their maintenance requests were ignored, while new tenants received immediate attention. But I was too busy setting up my office to pay much mind, at least until the night I found the first notice on my door. The notice appeared on a Friday, after a particularly exhausting week. I had spent 3 days in court defending the Rodriguez family, who were about to lose their 3-generation home because of a predatory loan with interest rates that had more than doubled in 2 years. I dragged myself home after 8 p.m., dreaming of a hot bath and takeout, when I saw the fluorescent pink paper taped to my door. Notice of lease violation. It announced in bold capital letters. I tore the paper from the door and stepped inside my apartment, tossing my heavy briefcase onto the couch. Under the kitchen light, I read the notice. Dear Ms. Reynolds, it has been determined that you are operating a business from your residence, which constitutes a direct violation of Clause 23B of your lease agreement. As a result, you are subject to a fine of $1,500, payable within 48 hours, or you will face immediate eviction proceedings. Management, Sunset Towers. I read the notice again, first confused, then angry. I wasn't running any business from my apartment. My office was 3 blocks away, intentionally, to keep my work and personal life separate. The next morning, I went straight to Frank's office on the ground floor. The door was open, and he was leaning back in his chair, talking on the phone, while spinning a pen between his fingers. I need to talk to you about this notice, I said when he finally hung up. Frank Wilkins didn't bother to stand. In his 50s, with neatly combed gray hair and a watch that looked far too expensive for his salary, he just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Ms. Reynolds, I was just thinking about you. I'm not operating any business. Out of my apartment. I have a properly registered office 3 blocks from here. Really? Frank opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Then how do you explain this? He spread 4 photographs across the table. The first showed me entering the building with my work briefcase. The second showed me sitting at my kitchen table, working on my laptop. The third and fourth were similar. Me, on different days, clearly working from home. I felt a chill run down my spine. You took pictures of me inside my apartment? That's invasion of privacy. The photos were taken from public angles, he said coolly, unfazed. And they clearly show you conducting business from your residence. Working on a laptop occasionally is not running a business. It's the 21st century. Everyone works. From home sometimes. Not according to the lease you signed. Clause 23B is very clear. I frowned. I don't remember that clause. Maybe you should read your contracts more carefully before signing, he said, his smile widening. The fine is $1,500, payable by Sunday night, cash or transfer. Something about all this felt wrong. Even if such a clause existed, the penalty seemed excessive. I'll need to check my copy of the lease, I said firmly. Of course, he shrugged. But the deadline stays the same. As I walked out of his office, I found Eleanor waiting in the hallway looking distressed. Mia, you too? She whispered, eyeing the notice I was still holding. Me too, what? The violation notices. I got one yesterday, claiming I have an unauthorized pet. She shook her head, incredulous. I don't even have pets. I'm allergic. Eleanor wasn't the only one. That afternoon, I spoke with 3 other tenants who had received similar notices for questionable violations. All of them were long-time residents. All of them were paying significantly lower rents than the newer tenants, and all of them were terrified. Last night, I tore through my apartment searching for my copy of the lease agreement. When I finally found it in a folder of documents, I sat down to read it carefully. Clause 23B. The tenant agrees not to use the property for any commercial or business purpose. Any violation will result in a $1,500 fine and/or immediate eviction at management's discretion. The clause was there, but something felt off. The paper in that section had a slightly different texture. I held the document up to the light, examining it closely. As a lawyer, I was used to analyzing legal documents. That's when I realized the page had been altered. Someone had replaced that specific paragraph. After I signed the contract. The discovery sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just aggressive management. It was fraud. On Monday, I went back to Frank's office, secretly recording the conversation on my phone. "I'm not paying the fine," I said calmly. "The clause you cited was inserted into the contract after I signed it. That's tampering with a legal document, Mr. Wilkins." His smile faltered for a second, but quickly returned. "Serious accusations, Ms. Reynolds. It would be a shame if you had to hire an expensive attorney to fight over something so trivial." He leaned forward. "We both know you've been struggling financially since you opened that little charity office. People like you don't belong at Sunset Towers anymore." "People like me?" "This building is moving up, improving its reputation. The days of rent control and subsidized housing are over." Our conversation was interrupted when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, holding her own notice. "Frank, this is outrageous. I'm getting another fine now for excessive noise. I'm 67 years old and I live alone." Frank rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "If you're unhappy, Mrs. Diaz, maybe it's time to find somewhere else to live." "This has been my home for 20 years. Eleanor's voice trembled. "Things change," Frank said coldly. "The neighborhood's developing. Market prices are rising. Either we evolve or get left behind." I placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder and faced Frank with a steady gaze. "This isn't over, Mr. Wilkins." After leaving his office, I took Eleanor to my apartment and shared my suspicions. "He's trying to force out long-term tenants with rent-controlled leases so he can renovate the units and charge way more." "But that's illegal," Eleanor exclaimed. "Yes, it is." I bit my lip, deep in thought. "And I'm going to find out exactly what's going on here." Little did I know, Frank Wilkins was just getting started, and his next move would change everything. The following week, I split my time between my clients' cases and a quiet investigation into Sunset Towers practices. I had already identified 7 tenants who received similar notices, all of them with old, protected leases, and all accused of supposed violations that looked completely fabricated. I was coming back from a particularly grueling court hearing on Thursday when I got a call from Eleanor. "Mia, you need to get home right now." Her voice was shaking. "Something's happening in your apartment." I sprinted the last few blocks to the building, my heart pounding. When I reached my floor, I froze in shock. My apartment door was wide open, and 2 men I had never seen before were carrying boxes filled with my belongings. Frank stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching it all. "What's going on here?" I demanded, blocking the men's path. "Oh, Ms. Reynolds," Frank turned to me with that fake smile. "We had an emergency. A dangerous gas leak was detected in your apartment. We had to go in to check." "A gas leak? Where's the technician?" "The gas company? They've already left. They confirmed it was serious." Frank motioned for the men to keep moving with my things. "Unfortunately, during the emergency inspection, we discovered several other serious violations." I pushed him aside and walked into my apartment. What I saw left me breathless. Every drawer was open, their contents scattered across the floor. My work files, ones I occasionally brought home, had been meticulously rifled through, and my laptop, which contained confidential client information, was gone. Frank appeared at the door and handed me a piece of paper. "This is your official eviction notice. You have 24 hours to remove your remaining belongings." "You can't do this," I replied automatically, shock quickly giving way to anger. "This is illegal on so many levels that—" "I can and I am," Frank interrupted. "It's all in the document. Multiple violations, authorized emergency entry, Evidence of prohibited business activity. He pointed at my scattered files. And look, more evidence. I snatched the eviction notice from his hand, my fingers trembling with rage. Through the hallway window, I saw one of the men carrying boxes with my belongings out to the sidewalk. "Be out of here in 24 hours, Frank said in a low voice, leaning in so only I could hear. "People like you don't belong in this building anymore." Eleanor stood at her door, watching the scene unfold, horrified. Other neighbors peered through the cracks in their doors, but no one intervened. At that moment, I made a decision. Frank clearly had no idea who I was or what I did for a living. He could have checked, of course, but his arrogance blinded him. All he saw was a young woman he assumed had no means to fight back. "I'll get my things," I said calmly. "But this isn't over, Frank." Over the next 2 hours, I gathered what I could of my belongings. Eleanor quietly helped me, her wrinkled hands folding my clothes into suitcases while I tried to organize my scattered work documents. "Where are you going to stay?" she asked, worried. "I'm going to call my friend Sophia," I replied, still in shock. "She has a couch." "This is so unfair." Eleanor shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "First Mrs. Gladwell from 3B, then Mr. Hernandez, and now you. We're all terrified, wondering who's next." As I zipped up the last suitcase, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. Eleanor and the other older tenants were vulnerable, with no resources to legally fight back against what was happening. Sophia picked up on the first ring, and her response was immediate. "Of course you can stay with me. I'm coming to get you now." While I waited on the sidewalk next to my boxes and suitcases, I looked up at the windows of Sunset Towers. I had just lost my apartment. My laptop containing critical information was gone, and my files had been ransacked. Most people in my situation would feel defeated. But as Sophia pulled up to the curb in her BMW and got out to help me with my bags, something was growing inside me. A cold determination that Frank Wilkins would soon regret provoking. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked, pulling me into a hug. "No," I answered honestly. "But I will be." What Frank didn't know, what he hadn't even bothered to find out, was that he had just wrongfully evicted a lawyer specialized in real estate law, someone who knew every detail of Pennsylvania's tenant laws, and I was about to use that knowledge to expose his entire scheme. Sophia's apartment was everything mine wasn't: spacious, stylish, in a luxury building with 24-hour security and a panoramic city view. While her Italian leather couch was definitely more comfortable than my bed, I barely slept that first night. "You should sue," Sophia said the next morning, handing me a cup of coffee in a mug that probably cost more than my entire dinnerware set, a lawsuit for invasion of privacy, unlawful entry, theft. She counted on her fingers. "You'd win easily." "Eventually, yes," I replied, sorting through my documents on her dining table. "But there's something bigger going on. Frank's not acting alone, and this isn't just about me." "Always the social crusader," Sophia smiled, though there was admiration in her voice. "So what's the plan?" "First, I need a new laptop and access to my cloud backups. Then, I'm going to investigate who else got evicted from Sunset Towers over the past year. I need to establish a pattern." While Sophia left for a meeting with corporate clients, I turned her chic living room into a makeshift command center. I bought a basic laptop and began rebuilding my case, digging through public records online. On the third day of my investigation, I decided to visit the city's housing department. While waiting in line to access property records, I noticed a middle-aged man reviewing the same files I had just consulted. "Interested in Sunset Towers?" he asked, noticing my attention. "You could say I have a personal interest," I replied cautiously. He extended his hand. "James Taylor, investigative journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer." Mia Reynolds. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "The lawyer who just got evicted? I've heard rumors about your case." "News travels fast. I've been investigating Marcus Collins for months," James explained. "He owns Sunset Towers and 10 other similar properties across the city. I've been getting repeated reports of aggressive eviction tactics at all his buildings, especially in neighborhoods undergoing gentrification." We sat down at a nearby cafe where James shared his research, Marcus Collins was a prominent businessman, owner of a real estate development company that was quickly acquiring properties in so-called up-and-coming neighborhoods. The pattern was always the same: buy old buildings with long-term tenants, replace management, and start renovating. The problem is, I've never been able to tie Collins directly to any questionable practices, James explained. He keeps his distance, delegating everything to property managers like his buddy Frank. So Frank is probably following orders from above, I concluded. James tilted his head. Maybe, but there are also rumors that some of these managers are running side schemes, profiting off both the owners and the tenants. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Undeclared commissions from new tenants, embezzling, funds meant for renovations, manipulating contracts. James lowered his voice. I have sources suggesting that Frank Wilkins is pocketing a significant cut from the operations at Sunset Towers. That would explain Frank's expensive watch and arrogant behavior. He wasn't just following orders, he was actively profiting from the evictions. We exchanged contacts, and James promised to share any new information he uncovered. Back at Sophia's apartment, I expanded my investigation, building a timeline of evictions at Sunset Towers. The pattern was undeniable. In the 18 months since Frank took over, 12 tenants, with long-standing rent-controlled leases, had been evicted for violations suspiciously similar to mine. All the apartments were later superficially renovated and rented out for 3 times the original price. My next step was clear. I needed to speak with the former tenants. Over the following 2 weeks, I tracked down and interviewed 8 of the previous residents. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine: sudden notices for fabricated violations, outrageous fines, emergency entries into their apartments, and ultimately, swift and aggressive evictions. He planted bugs in my apartment, said Maria Delgado, a 58-year-old nurse who had lived at Sunset Towers for 15 years. One day I came home, and there were cockroaches coming out of a hole in the wall that wasn't there when I left for work. The next day, I got a notice for unsanitary conditions. For me, it was unauthorized repairs, said Kevin Brooks, a university professor evicted 6 months earlier. I replaced a burnt-out light bulb and supposedly interfered with the building's electrical system. Each interview strengthened my case, but something crucial was still missing: solid proof of document tampering and the underlying financial scheme. I needed access to the building's internal records, and there was only one way to get it. In the 3rd week after my eviction, I quietly visited Eleanor. Frank had increased security in the building, so I entered as a guest of another tenant and climbed up the fire escape to her floor. I have some worrying news, Eleanor whispered, serving me tea in her small living room. Frank installed cameras in the hallways, and I heard that 3 other apartments got notices this week. He's speeding up the process, I murmured. We need to act fast. I laid out my plan. Eleanor, as a still legitimate tenant, would officially request a complete copy of her lease agreement and payment history, a right guaranteed by law. That would give us a legitimate sample of how the original contracts looked to compare against the altered ones. And there's more, Eleanor continued, leaning forward. After what happened to you, I installed a small security camera in my apartment. One of those that looks like a phone charger. My nephew insisted. My heart raced. Eleanor, that's brilliant. I haven't caught anything suspicious yet, but at least I feel safer. When I left Eleanor's apartment that night, I had no idea. Our plan would become crucial much sooner than we expected. The next day, Eleanor called me in a panic. Mia, I just got a final notice. Her voice was trembling. Frank claims I'm harboring unauthorized visitors and breaking noise regulations. I have 72 hours to pay a $2,000 fine or I'll be evicted. The fine was clearly designed to be impossible to pay on her teacher's pension. Frank had found his next target. What we didn't know at that moment was that Eleanor would be key to turning everything around. They can't do this to you, Eleanor, I said firmly, feeling anger rise as we spoke over the phone. I'm not going to let this happen again. What can we do? Her voice sounded defeated. I don't have $2,000, and if I'm evicted, I have nowhere to go. Just don't let Frank into your apartment under any circumstances. I instructed. If he shows up with some fake emergency, call the police, then call me, and keep that camera recording. That same night, I met James in the parking lot of a mall on the edge of town. He had asked for a discreet meeting after uncovering something about Sunset Tower's financial dealings. Collins hired a new accountant 3 months ago. James explained, showing me documents in the back seat of his car. This guy has a big mouth when he drinks, and he likes to drink. The documents showed massive discrepancies between the IRA reported amounts for renovations and what was actually being spent. In one specific case, $50,000 had been allocated for renovating an apartment, but the real invoices only added up to $15,000. Where's the rest of the money? I asked. Exactly. James grinned. And there's more. The contracts with new tenants show $3,000 security deposits, but only $1,500 is officially recorded. Frank is pocketing the difference, I concluded. He's not just evicting people to raise rents for Collins. He's running his own side scheme. We need more solid evidence. James sighed. Internal documents, recorded admissions, something undeniable. As I was heading back to Sophia's apartment, I got a frantic call from Eleanor. Mia, they just left Frank and 2 men. They went into my apartment while I was at the market. Are you okay? Did they take anything? I'm shaking, but I'm okay, she replied. And yes, they left things. There's a huge speaker in the middle of my living room that isn't mine, and it looks like they threw trash in some corners. They're clearly planting evidence for the noise and unsanitary conditions charges. My heart was pounding. The camera, Eleanor? Was the camera working? Yes. She sounded like a flicker of hope had returned. It was charging in the outlet near the entrance. It has a clear view of the living room. Hey, don't touch anything, I instructed. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I called a cab and practically ran to Eleanor's apartment. I found the elderly teacher sitting stiffly in her armchair, staring at a sound system that looked completely out of place in her modest decor. This isn't mine, she said simply. Nor is that trash scattered around. I've lived here for 20 years, Mia. You've seen my apartment. I keep everything spotless. I know you do. I cautiously approached the wall charger that hid the small camera. Let's see what we've got here. I connected the camera to my new laptop and transferred the footage. As we started watching, we could hardly believe our luck. The recording clearly showed Frank and 2 assistants entering the apartment. Make it quick, Frank instructed. She only goes to the market for about 40 minutes on Thursdays. The men methodically placed the speaker in the middle of the room while Frank tossed trash into strategic corners. This will guarantee the noise and unsanitary violations, Frank said, smirking. One more apartment we can renovate and rent for triple. One of the assistants looked uncomfortable. I don't know, boss. She's an elderly woman. She's an obstacle, Frank replied coldly. Just like that annoying lawyer from 5C. Speaking of which, where's her laptop? In your office, locked in the bottom drawer, the second man answered. I glanced at Eleanor, who looked just as shocked as I was. They had just confessed to stealing my laptop, on top of breaking and entering and fabricating evidence against Eleanor. But the most incriminating part was yet to come. As they were leaving, Frank was on the phone. Yeah, another apartment cleared out by the weekend. Officially, the renovation will cost $45,000 for Collins, but I got the contractor who'll do it for $18,000. We split the rest as usual, 20% for you to keep Collins distracted with legal issues. Yeah, of course. Blackwell, he'll never... No. I paused the video, barely able to process what we had just witnessed. This is everything we needed, I stammered. They confessed to everything. Breaking and entering, evidence tampering, the entire financial fraud scheme, and even mentioned someone named Blackwell, probably the lawyer keeping Collins in the dark. Eleanor was crying, but they were tears of relief. So, does this mean we can stop them? I can stay in my home? This and so much more. I said, immediately backing up the video in 3 separate locations. First, we're going to the police. And then, I think it's time to meet Marcus Collins in person. Just before leaving, I noticed something even more shocking in the recording. In the final seconds, as Frank was closing the door, he said, "And make sure that water leak in the old teacher's apartment on the 3rd floor happens on Sunday." Collins wants all the old tenants gone by the end of the year. Eleanor covered her mouth with both hands. "They're planning to destroy my apartment." "Not just yours," I replied, feeling a fresh wave of urgency. "All the older apartments. We need to act now." Immediately, I called Detective Sarah Morris, a contact I had made during a previous real estate fraud case. I quickly explained the situation, emphasizing the imminent danger to the tenants. "Bring me the video right now," she said without hesitation. "And those other tenants need to be warned." As I headed to the police station with Eleanor and our evidence in hand, I knew we were about to blow open a scheme much bigger than I ever imagined when I first found that pink notice on my door. Detective Sarah Morris watched the recording 3 times, her professional face barely containing her growing outrage. "This is undeniable proof of multiple crimes," she finally said, closing the laptop. "Burglary, evidence tampering, conspiracy, extortion, embezzlement. And they still have my laptop, which contains confidential client information," I added. Sarah made a few notes. "We can get a search warrant for Frank's office today. As for the plan to sabotage the apartments, we'll assign undercover officers to monitor the building over the weekend." While Sarah worked on the warrant, I called Sophia. I needed her help for the next phase of my plan. "How's your friendship with Janet, Marcus Collins' executive assistant?" I asked as soon as she answered. "We still grab lunch occasionally." "Why?" "I need a meeting with Collins, urgent, and it can't go through his lawyer, Blackwell." There was a pause. "Mia, what are you planning?" "Justice," I answered simply, "and I need your help." The next morning, the police executed the warrant at Frank's office. They found not only my laptop, but also a detailed system of parallel records documenting the entire scheme. Original and doctored contracts side by side, lists of tenants targeted for eviction, records of inflated renovation costs, and spreadsheets, showing the laundered money. Frank was taken into custody for questioning, his arrogance finally cracking when he realized the seriousness of the charges. Meanwhile, Sophia worked her magic, and I secured a meeting with Marcus Collins for noon. The Collins development headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown skyscraper. The receptionist led me into a luxurious waiting room where I waited 15 minutes before being escorted to Collins's office. Marcus Collins wasn't what I had imagined. At 45, he looked more like a college professor than a real estate tycoon, thin-rimmed glasses, gray streaks at his temples, and a genuinely curious expression when I walked in. "Ms. Reynolds," he stood up to greet me. "Janet said it was urgent. Something about Sunset Towers that couldn't wait for the usual channels. How can I help you?" I decided to get straight to the point. "Mr. Collins, your property manager Frank Wilkins is currently in police custody, and your attorney, Howard Blackwell, is probably next." Collins blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "They've been running an elaborate scheme on your properties, illegally evicting long-term tenants with rent-controlled leases, inflating renovation costs, and embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from you." "These are very serious accusations," he said cautiously, motioning for me to sit down. "Do you have proof?" I placed a folder on his desk. Police reports, copies of the records found in Frank's office, and a recording showing Frank and his assistants planting false evidence against tenants to justify evictions. As Collins examined the documents, I continued. "I don't know if you were aware of these practices, but they've been going on for at least 18 months, affecting dozens of people." Collins looked genuinely horrified as he read. "This can't be right. Blackwell oversees all the properties. He assured me we were following all legal procedures." "Blackwell is getting 20% of the diverted money to keep you in the dark," I explained, pointing to a specific spreadsheet. "He and Frank have been working together to, in Frank's own words, bleed you slowly, while getting rid of the social trashes from your buildings." Collins turned pale. "My God." On his computer, I played a clip from Eleanor's video, where Frank explicitly mentioned the deal with Blackwell. Collins watched in silence, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "How much?" he finally asked. "How much did they steal?" "Our preliminary estimates suggest at least $800,000 over the past 18 months, just from Sunset Towers. If they're running the same scheme in your other properties..." Collins pressed a button on his phone. "Janet, cancel my appointments for the rest of the day, and try to locate Blackwell immediately." Turning back to me, he asked, "What do you want, Ms. Reynolds? I assume you didn't come here just to inform me." "I want justice for the tenants who were illegally evicted," I said firmly. "Immediate reinstatement for anyone who wants to return, with upgraded leases that preserve their original rights." Collins nodded. "Understandable. Financial compensation for emotional damages, moving costs, and any losses suffered during the evictions. Also reasonable. Legitimate renovations for the older apartments without excessive rent increases." Collins frowned. "That might be more financially complicated, but I understand the principle." "And finally," I continued, "a fund to support tenants across the city who are facing predatory evictions, not just those in your properties." He hesitated. "That seems a bit beyond the scope of the immediate issue." I pulled up my phone and showed him an email from James Taylor. "The Philadelphia Inquirer is publishing a detailed article on this scheme tomorrow. The story is ready to go." Collins let out a long sigh. "I see. You're offering me a chance to manage a PR disaster." "I'm offering you a chance to do the right thing and, at the same time, turn a potential disaster into an opportunity to lead positive change in the real estate industry." At that moment, the office door burst open, and Howard Blackwell walked in, his immaculate suit contrasting sharply with his agitated expression. "Marcus, we need to talk about the situation at Sunset." He stopped when he saw me. "Who are you?" "Howard," Collins said coldly. "This is Mia Reynolds, one of the tenants illegally evicted by Frank Wilkins. She's also an attorney specializing in real estate law." Blackwell visibly paled, "And she just showed me fascinating evidence of how you and Frank have been stealing from me while throwing vulnerable people out of my buildings." "Marcus, I don't know what lies you've been told, but..." "Enough." Collins cut him off. "The police already have the evidence, Howard, and I have copies right here." Blackwell shot me a venomous glare before switching tactics. "We can settle this quietly, Marcus. No need to involve authorities or the press." Collins stood up. "I think it's too late for that, and I suggest you speak to your lawyer." After Blackwell was escorted out by security, Collins turned his attention back to me. "You were right to come directly to me, Ms. Reynolds, and it seems I owe you a thank you for exposing this corruption within my organization." "I don't need thanks," I replied. "I need real action." Collins nodded slowly. "I'll accept all your conditions, with one of my own. I want you to lead the implementation of these changes." I was genuinely surprised. "What do you mean?" "As legal counsel, overseeing the reinstatement of the tenants, the creation of the support fund, and helping us rewrite our management policies." He gave me a tired smile. "I can't fix this alone, and it seems like you know the problems better than I do." This is unexpected. Think of it as a chance to create real change from within. With my resources and your expertise, we could turn this awful situation into a model for the entire industry. I considered the offer. Working with Collins could give me a much greater reach and impact than I could ever achieve alone. On the other hand, I'd be aligning myself with someone whose properties had caused so much harm. "I'll think about your offer," I finally said. "But regardless of my decision, I expect us to start implementing the changes immediately." As I left his office, I realized I had achieved far more than I ever expected when I started this fight 3 weeks earlier. It wasn't just about getting my apartment back anymore. It was about changing an entire system. I'll never forget the look on Frank's face when we met again, this time in a courtroom 3 days later. He was in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled after 2 nights in jail, all his arrogance replaced by a look of disbelief when he saw me sitting next to Marcus Collins at the prosecution's table. As a result of new evidence, the judge announced, Mr. Wilkins will remain in custody awaiting trial on multiple charges, including fraud, unlawful entry, document forgery, and extortion. Frank shot me a look of pure hatred as he was led away. Blackwell was in a similar situation, although he had managed to post bail thanks to his connections. The investigation was expanding to include other property managers and attorneys potentially involved in similar schemes across the city. The next day, I returned to Sunset Towers, this time as Collins' official guest, accompanied by Detective Sarah. As we rode up in the elevator, I felt a strange mix of emotions. This had been my home for 3 years, until I was violently forced out. Eleanor was waiting for me in the lobby, radiating an energy that made her look 10 years younger. You did it, Mia! You really did it! No, Eleanor, we did it, I corrected her, pulling her into a hug. Your hidden camera made all the difference. To my surprise, Collins had kept his word remarkably well. A new management team was already in place, and the evicted tenants were being contacted with offers to return under improved lease terms. For those who didn't want to come back, substantial financial compensation was being negotiated. When I reached my old apartment, I found it was already being prepared for my return. The damage caused during the forced entry had been repaired, and my remaining belongings carefully preserved. You can move back in whenever you're ready, Collins informed me. And about my offer. After much reflection and consulting, with Sophia, who at first thought I was crazy for considering anything other than a high-profile law firm position, I made my decision. I'll work with you, Mr. Collins, but not for you. I explained. My office will remain independent, but we can form a partnership focused on housing reform. I want to keep my freedom to defend tenants against predatory landlords, including you, if necessary. Collins smiled. Fair enough. I think that arrangement will keep us honest. In the weeks that followed, we implemented sweeping changes not just at Sunset Towers, but across all of Collins' properties. I established a tenant ombudsman system so residents could report issues directly, bypassing potentially corrupt managers. Renovations on older units began, with rent increases capped at reasonable percentages. The support fund for vulnerable tenants was established with an initial endowment of to 2 million orstein, far more than I had expected. Collins, to my surprise, seemed genuinely committed to reforming his business practices, partly from newfound conviction, and partly, I suspected, to rehabilitate his public image after the scandal. 3 months later, sitting in my reclaimed apartment, I received an unexpected call from the mayor's office. Ms. Reynolds, we'd like to invite you to a ceremony at City Hall next week. It's related to the Sunset Towers case. I accepted without thinking much, assuming it would be some kind of formal recognition for the case that had made headlines across the city. On the day of the ceremony, I was shocked to find not only city officials but dozens of tenants I had never met before. People from all over the city who, as I soon discovered, had similar stories to tell. The mayor approached the podium. Today, I am pleased to announce the Philadelphia Tenant Protection Initiative, a new city program fighting predatory evictions and abusive real estate practices in our city. She went on to explain how the Sunset Towers case had exposed systemic vulnerabilities in the existing tenant protections. The new initiative would include a dedicated task force, a hotline for complaints, and expanded legal resources for low-income tenants, all funded, surprisingly, by an anonymous donation that I later found out had come from Collins. After the presentation, an elderly woman came up to me. You don't know me, she said, but I live in one of the buildings across town. Our manager was doing exactly the same things as that Frank guy, until your case went public. Literally overnight, everything changed. The fines stopped, the threats ended. She gripped my hand tightly. You saved our community without even knowing we existed. Similar stories repeated throughout the reception. Landlords and managers across the city were suddenly reconsidering aggressive tactics, afraid they might be the next target of investigation. The ripple effect had reached far beyond anything I could have imagined. That night, walking home under Philadelphia's night sky, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. What had started as a personal fight for justice had turned into something much bigger. My phone rang. It was Sophia. "So, how does it feel to be the hero of the day?" she asked, her teasing tone barely hiding her genuine pride. "Strange," I answered. "Honestly. I was just trying to get my apartment back and help Eleanor. And you ended up starting a housing revolution," she laughed. "You know, I still think you're crazy for turning down that corporate job, but I'm proud of you, Mia. You found your true purpose." When I reached Sunset Towers, I stopped for a moment to look up at the building. The lights in the windows weren't just electric lamps to me now. They were homes, communities, stories. People living their lives with the security everyone deserves. The next morning, I found a line of people waiting outside my small office. Different stories, but the same theme. Tenants facing injustice, looking for help. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with new cases. I hired 2 assistant attorneys that week and 2 more the following month. Reynolds' legal aid was growing, and so was our impact. 6 months after my eviction, as I was helping a single mother fight an abusive rent hike, I realized that Frank Wilkins had, without knowing, given me an extraordinary gift when he posted that pink notice on my door. He had picked the wrong person to intimidate, not because I was a lawyer, though that certainly helped, but because I refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. And that's a choice anyone can make, no matter their profession. Sometimes when I walk through the newly renovated halls of Sunset Towers and see Eleanor watering her plants, or pass by the new community center on the ground floor where Frank's office used to be, I remember those desperate 24 hours after my eviction. The landlord really didn't know I was a lawyer when he wrongfully evicted me. But what he, and I, discovered through this journey was something far more important, that a single determined person really can change an entire system, especially when they find unexpected allies along the way, and that I've learned is a power within all of us.